This is a story about our community. We are Anishinaabe, Chippewa the Thames First Nation in Muncey, Ontario.
We wanted to know some of the stories of our elders who went to residential school.
We wanted to know how their residential school experiences had an impact on our lives.
As their children,
their grandchildren,
their great-grandchildren,
their community,
their Ojibwe culture and language.
We've wanted to know why our elders had to go to residential schools.
What it felt like to leave their families.
What did they lose in those years, and how did they heal themselves?
We want to honor the keepers of our culture, our elders.
We want to understand who we are today because of their sacrifices.
It is with great respect and gratitude that we open our hearts and listen.
We are the children of your stories.
We sing together in one voice, in strength and in love.
Secrets.
The European presence in Canada brought disease, starvation, and the loss of lands, natural resources, and culture for First Nations people.
You have different chiefs from time to time who, in their mind, for the future of their people, the only way they could survive is to learn how to coexist with these European nations in some way. And they listened to the stories of the British officials and the missionaries, and it was better than the alternative of dying from starvation. So they figured that if they educate their children, create these institutions, their people would survive a lot longer. And of course, things turned out differently than they had visioned. They were afraid of Indians, of these savages, and that's where people wanted to settle as well. So the assimilation process began. I guess some of them felt like their intentions were good, but it does not dismiss the way they went about it.
Perhaps the worst plague of all that the foreigners brought was their concept of residential schools, the taking of First Nations babies and children from their families and communities, the institutionalized erosion of trust, security, and affection, the often abusive destruction of childhood, language, culture, the imposition of Christianity on a spiritual people, the intergenerational cycle of self-hate and internalized oppression, sanctioned and funded by the Canadian government, managed by European churches. Beginning in the early 1800s and not ending until the 1980s, these residential schools cropped up all across Canada. Many generations of Chippewas of the Thames First Nation children were sent to 3 of these schools. Elgin Institute at Chippewa of the Thames First Nation was run by what is now the United Church. Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario was run by the Anglican Church. And Shingwak Indian Residential School in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario was also run by the Anglican Church. These children were 3 to 10 years old when they arrived, and some stayed their entire youth. Then they were sent back to their home communities to fend for themselves. The poverty caused by oppression meant that resources were scarce, and for some, the residential schools provided food, shelter, and education.
The whole residential school experiment, I think, was just one horrible experiment that should have never happened.
They took everything from you. They took your spirit, your language.
I'd say I lost 2/3 of my life, you know. They got that main streak from being in those schools, you know, or no feelings like.
They considered the natives as savages and make sure that they go to school and then they'll forget their customs, their ceremonies, their dancing, and I'm sure that they never once thought maybe we should learn their way first, you know.
Mostly what I think I carry with me from residential school is loneliness.
No love at all from anybody. That's why Native people are so standoffish, you know, because they never learn how to love. And treat their children the same way, and their children grow up feeling that they're not of value.
The residential school experience has had a ripple effect among Native people, for generations. The intergenerational effects of residential school do not mean that you have gone to residential school yourself.
Our skills of raising children, I had to learn this all over again. I had to learn it from my own kids and my grandchildren.
Oh, I wish to heaven I could have given them affection, because I never put my arms around my kids, and it still hurts me. And my daughter was telling me yesterday, when you grow up like that without affection, you have to break that cycle someplace along the way.
The young people are saying, we don't want a legacy of alcoholism, of prisons and whatnot. Therefore, it's up to you guys to teach us about the traditional worldview. Some institutions used residential school as the social services of the time. Families that were having problems, scooped the kids out, put them into residential school.
The RCMP was recruited a lot of times to go pick up these children, and if they heard of a breakup or something. Sometimes if the parents gave a hard time, they would wait till the parents weren't home, and then they would go and arrest the children and send them to the residential schools.
When they were taken out of their home, they were taken to whatever school needed some children to fill their quota.
It was Depression time. There was no jobs, there was no money in circulation. And when the residential schools come into play, the families felt at least the children could be fed 3 meals a day, and they knew they would get their schooling. That is why they consented to the idea.
When I was 17, I finally got the nerve to ask my mother, Mom, why did you ever send us away to that school? Were we that bad? And she said, it was the law, Cheryl.
Well, my grandfather had a beautiful farm, and we grew all of our own vegetables and stuff. But when he died, my mother and my grandmother couldn't keep the farm up. So this is why my mother thought it would be better if I went to school.
We were quite poor. I think that's probably the reason why we went there. Our family lived in a one-room building.
We had just lost our father. Our father had been a chief for that year, and it was a very sad time. My grandfather was telling me that he wrote to the government. He didn't want to see us be taken away, that he would take care of us. But he never got no word back.
The most damage these residential schools did to people was take the kids out of the family setting.
Our parents weren't given the opportunity to love their children, and children were divorced from their families. That left people grieving back in the communities for their children, but it also left the children grieving at the institutions for their home and loved ones. And that loss of love, a child dies. Emotionally, they die when they're not nurtured. They die without touch, love, place. They die without safety.
Remember the first night I went in, I fought the first night, and then the next morning I was fighting all morning. So like a hazing. A lot of the abuse was from the older kids. And you didn't dare tell, you just didn't do it, or you were beat severely and much worse, so nobody did.
We were all crying because we didn't know where they were taking us. We didn't speak English. I remember getting on the boat and going across the bay. When it was time to go to bed, Sheila and Merle were put in a different dormitory. I remember Merle crying in the middle of the night. And she was saying, Doris, Doris, Anishmaya and Doris. I remember in the morning this bell ringing really loud. Somebody coming into that dormitory where I was sleeping, and I had my 2 sisters sleeping with me. And she came over, she says, we'll have none of that. Get up. I remember her saying that to my 2 sisters, and she grabbed them. And she pulled him out of bed and, "Be quiet," she says to my sister. And she hit her. We weren't hit by our parents. I kicked her with my bare feet, and "I'm not going to cry. He can hit me. I'm not going to let nobody tell me that I can't speak my language. That's me, that's me." And that's what kept me going.
I just remember pulling up to this big brick building and the writing on the wall at Fort Francis Indian Residential School. I had never seen a nun before. So, she had on this long black dress with this long black veil. All you could see was her little face with this great big cross hanging down. And I remember them taking my brother down this hall. I could hear his screams echoing throughout the school. Everything echoed in that school. We were never allowed to visit each other in the school. We weren't even allowed to just touch each other, I really miss that family cohesiveness. And then plus, we had a huge extended family too, We had grandpa and grandma, and we had aunts and uncles. You were never alone.
Our language contains our relationship to creation, because that all Indian people have said those same words. So you're talking with your grandparents' heart.
I remember before I got to that school, I could understand my own language. What hurt most was we lost that, the medicinal parts of it, from my people. My grandmother knew it. If you got caught speaking that language, you either got a whipping over it or you get a good bawling out.
People don't realize, when you tear a culture, a language, lands, and things that mean so dearly to us, tear that out, what an impact it has. It's still a very personal, very hurtful thing for me to think about, that I can't speak my own language. When you picture a prison where there's inmates, and some of the letters, they actually refer to these children as inmates. And the first thing they did was they shaved their hair. And this was traumatic for the children because they've always had long hair, and hair is, very much a part of culture.
Concentration camp life, and you had no freedom.
And they were assigned numbers right away. Those numbers were sewed onto their socks and their pants and their clothes.
They give us clothes with bib overalls were the standard. Shoes, and all our clothes had a number. My number was 28.
Once it started to get cold, I remember the first 3 years I was in, there were no coats.
They were dormitories, but you had single cots, all lined up. Side by side.
You usually cried when you went to sleep, when you wanted your mother, brother and sisters around, there was nobody there.
I had to stay behind a fence, in an enclosure, so like a prisoner of war camp, and we had no rights. We weren't considered persons. We fit in the category of some sort of subhuman.
The concept of child slave labor camps became very evident in residential school institutions, very much alive in Canada, right until the 1950s, 1960s, in some places 1970s and 1980s. When the children are old enough to work, they work half the day, go to school for half the day, and they alternate. The children that are too young to work, they clean the toilets, clean the bathroom, clean the dorms. That was their job.
The farm was operated by the children. Kids did it all. The fields were approximately 100-acre fields, plowing by hand, walking behind a plow. And we grew all our own food and all the grain for the cattle, hay and that for the horses. It was all grown on that farm. Them stock barns were big barns, if you remember. There's one standing, that's the horse barn. That was the smallest of the two. They were Holstein thoroughbreds, and every pound of milk had to be weighed, and they had to be clean as a plate at all times.
What I remember about the laundry was the big mangles where we run the sheets through. I darned a lot of socks. They made the uniforms. everyone wore. And
The floors that had to be washed and scrubbed, and all the clothes that had to be washed. You maintained that whole school. Everybody did.
I was working for the head matron of the school. She took me as her personal maid. Then when she left the school, she took me along with her. Her daughter, she had 2 children. I took care of both families. I never ever got paid for it. I was just what you call a personal slave. And I worked so hard and so long and so many years for that woman.
They rang a bell. You could hear it for 5 miles around when it rang. Mount Elgin, everybody referred to it as Mush Hole. I think it got its name from the mush in the morning, 365 days a year.
You might get a soup, but it had a lot of, they would have maggots in it. But you had to eat it or you didn't have nothing. So it was a huge farming operation. The only thing we got from the cattle was the skim milk that was left. But they sold all the cream. The pigs, they sold them, they had hundreds of chickens. But they sold all the eggs.
And we never had no meat of any kind, or even eggs for breakfast. We were always hungry.
It makes them desperate. Early Sunday mornings, we would all sneak out, see about 4 or 5 in the morning. Normal to see 20 or 30 kids all head for the garbage dump, because Saturday night was the night all the grocery stores would dump all their garbage. And this is usually a whole lot of them filled up. But of course it was dangerous too. Of course there were rats in there, and there was all sorts of vermin within the dumps.
The upper kitchen was the elite. This is where all the good food went. This is where all the staff ate. All the fruit and the vegetables and the meat, and the superintendent had a dining room all of their own, him and his wife, and you were taught how to serve them. You couldn't make a mistake either.
Native kids didn't respond well in residential school to the didactic learning. The teacher is the expert, you don't know anything. When an elder teaches you, they believe that you have the capacity to understand already. The impacts of residential school experience, we're all still being affected. Spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally. We don't feel that we have the intellectual capacity to achieve in what the schools say is the right way to learn. We still have students in Ontario who are terrified to go to university because they don't believe they're smart enough. And therefore you hold yourself back. That's internalized oppression.
They'd tell us we were paganistic type people. We had no God. And you get in there for a few years and you believe that, especially a kid.
What was it about Native spirituality which scared the missionaries was not that it was paganistic, is because it was superior to their connection with Jesus. That the spirit world and the physical world are one, they're interconnected, and that the ceremonies, as opposed to a church service, our ceremonies allow us to interface with that spirit world. And that's lost in the spirituality that we lost as a part of the influence of these residential school experience.
No way. I have never been back to churches since I left there. Too much is too much.
The church is a big influence in my life still. My husband and I are both part of the All Native Circle Conference within the United Church of Canada. We do smudging and things that are brought in through the spirituality of our culture.
When I first went in, I think the law at that time was that Indians were not persons, so they had no legal rights. You had to follow, or you were severely punished, and I mean severely punished. Usually he laid them over a bench, girls or boys, and stripped them down, and then, just beat on them. He would be just so tired from beating them that he had to stop.
the boys' playroom and the girls' playroom. They opened everything up, all the doors, so you could hear this when they were beating her. And that place went dead silence, even among the officers. Never forget it.
We were strapped in front of the whole school at chapel time.
It was all public. And they had this huge, wide strap that was a pulley they use on farm implements. It was usually real thick, heavy, and it did a lot of damage.
Instead of, some of them like to catch you up to here with it right on the wrist, and you'd be just swollen up. And they had salt water and they'd daub you, This one nurse they had there, I think if she had a gun, she'd have shot one of them other officers for doing that. We had some in there that was good, but they didn't seem to last too long, They were.
They called RCMP from Muncey. The RCMP was there stationed right there. They would come up and they would stand. They had to stand while he gave them the strap to make sure that it wasn't going too far, because there was rumors where it did get out of hand.
Very controlled environment. It was like a jail. And the whole school was controlled by gangs. The older kids used to control the younger kids, and a lot of the kids were also subjected to a lot of torture. Some of them, I recall, were forced to hold on to electric fences, and they made some hang from hot water pipes.
Yeah, there was always that threat. There was always that threat of my brothers. See, Marie being the bully, she also had two bigger brothers on the older boy's side, and she would always say to me, if you don't do this for me, I will have my brothers beat your brother up. And they would.
A lot of the kids were forced by the older kids. You couldn't cry. You didn't dare, or you got it worse later. Maybe it was something to get back at the authority in the school, just to show them that you were tough. So that's what you had to do.
Anyone who had wet the bed was, they had to take their sheets off of their bed, and they had to go and stand out in the hall with their sheets so that everybody knew that they had wet their bed. So they were publicly humiliated in that way.
They weren't supposed to be ashamed only of the abuse. They were supposed to be ashamed of their culture. They were supposed to be ashamed of their stupidity. They were supposed to be ashamed of having led these people to this abuse, because they are made to feel like they're the problem. It's your fault. If you weren't such a dirty person, if you didn't have the devil on you, if you didn't wear your clothes that way, if you didn't have bare feet, if you didn't have black hair, if you didn't have blue eyes, it's your fault. That's shame. And that's what you carry. And that's your private legacy that you don't want to tell other people, because shame is a thing you put on yourself. Fear of rejection will keep us from, talking about those deep, dark secrets that we have in our lives.
My girlfriend, she got sick, and so I told the girl's matron, I said, she's very sick, and she said, oh, she's not sick, she's just lazy. But she kept sitting down in the playroom there, and she couldn't move, so she got sicker and sicker. So finally I went to the head matron, and the head matron took her upstairs to the infirmary, and her appendix broke, and she died.
No, and we stayed in a basement. We could congregate, while it was cold outside in a basement, but they decided they were going to paint it, and everybody had to stand outside. And I got sick out of that, and, they didn't throw me in a hospital. They just kept me in the sick room. So I spent about 3 months in there. Pneumonia I caught. Of course, I recall